All that's Ed. I now would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. If you think your ancestors were never in Canada, maybe you should think again. Many Americans and immigrants crossed the border in search of land, work, refuge, or military service. Tonight, you'll learn how to trace births, marriages, deaths, and migrations in Canada and discover records that may reveal overlooked chapters in your family's history. Hailing from southwestern Ontario, our presenter tonight is Kathryn Lake Hogan, a professional genealogist, educator, and speaker specializing in Canadian family history. She's the founder of Looking for Ancestors and is known for making genealogy approachable, engaging, and, dare we say, fun. Kathryn teaches on a variety of topics, including loyalist ancestry, immigration, and migration patterns. She's presented for major organizations, including Roots Tech, Legacy Family Tree Webinars, the Salt Lake Institute of Genealogy, and the GRIP Genealogy Institute. Her articles have been featured in Family Tree Magazine and the APG Quarterly. And she's also held a leadership roles with the Ontario Ancestors and the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada. So while she's not researching or teaching, you might find her in the gym. And around here, she might be there. Kathryn is a beginner power lifter. So please join me welcoming Kathryn Lake Hogan.
Thank you so much, Dan. Well, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, wonderful. Okay, we are going to be talking about finding your American ancestor using Canadian records. I'm just going to tuck that away right now. Okay, so I do have to do one housekeeping item with you, and that is a copyright notice to let you know that the presentation and the handout are copyrighted materials. And I ask that you please do not copy, record, take screenshots of the presentation or the handout and post them online. The recorded presentation will be available to the members of the society on the website for you to view at your convenience. Excuse me. And the information in this presentation and the links are all current as of, I believe, March 24th, 2026. And I say that because websites change, they update, and they even disappear overnight. So when reviewing the recording of this presentation, please keep that in mind. Or when you go to visit a link in your handout and it no longer works, that's because sometimes those links change. Okay, so let's dive in to our presentation. On your handout, there are 10 reasons your ancestor may have come to Canada. And during our time together, we're going to look at 8 of those reasons. So this is what you're going to learn about today. Immigration. Did your ancestor come to North America through a Canadian port of entry? Perhaps your ancestor took advantage of the opportunity to get free land in Canada. Perhaps your ancestors migrated through Canada before settling in America. Did your ancestors say "I do" in Canada? Maybe your ancestor was born here in Canada, or maybe they took their last breath here. Perhaps your ancestor came to Canada to escape poverty, persecution, or slavery. And maybe your ancestor served in the Canadian Forces. Now, my belief is you really can't do family history without maps. The significance of maps in genealogical research cannot be overstated, especially when tracing ancestors across the Canadian-American border. Now, this map here highlights all of the US counties, not the states, the US counties that border Canada. All right, and when we zoom in a little bit, magnify a section of that map, it really shows you all those counties that border along Canada. So the blue colored counties border Canada on a waterway, and we're looking here at Michigan and Ohio and New York, okay, and into Vermont there. And the green colored counties border Canada by land. All right, now I want you to take a moment. We're gonna take about 5 seconds here, and I want you to look at this map, and I want you to look at how many other counties are bordering those marked green and blue. Okay, now ask yourself, was it possible my ancestors were ever in Canada? Let's get started with immigration. If you're having trouble locating your ancestor in US immigration and passenger records, consider that they may have come through a Canadian port. Their ship may have changed course or docked in Canada due to bad weather. It might have been more affordable for your ancestor to travel to Canada by ship or ocean liner and then continue inland by train or steamer to reach their final destination in the United States. Check ship passenger records and immigration records on the Library and Archives Canada website, Family Search, and Ancestry. Here we have a ship passenger record. It's from the SS Corsican, and it arrived on July 1st, 1901 at the port of Quebec, having embarked from Liverpool, England. Now, if we look at that right-hand column, we see that all of these passengers here on this page were headed to New York and Boston. On the next page, okay, we have these passengers were traveling to Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. And these passengers were headed to Baltimore, Seattle, Cleveland, Iowa, and Pittsburgh. Here's another passenger list, and this is from the SS Circassia, and it left Liverpool, England, and arrived in Quebec City, Quebec on June 18th, 1883. And on board was a young man named George Littlewood. Now, George was 21 years old, and he was traveling to Mankato, Minnesota with George Fletcher, who would eventually become Littlewood's brother-in-law. Like many of us, our ancestors were bargain hunters too. Littlewood and Fletcher sailed to Canada instead of America because it was probably cheaper to come to Canada and then travel by inbound steamer and or rail to their final destination of Mankato. Now, this may have been the only time either George was in Canada, and yet here we have their names recorded on an important Canadian record, the ship passenger list. All right, here is another passenger record, and this time it's for the SS Empress of Asia for January 21st, 1920. And here we have Lucy B. Ashton. Now, Lucy was not immigrating to Canada, and she was not immigrating to the United States. Lucy was an American citizen born in Chicago. In 1920, she arrived at the port of Vancouver in British Columbia from Shanghai, China. She stated she was destined to her father in St. Paul, Minnesota. Lucy was not in Canada for very long at all. She was just passing through. When you can't find the ship passenger record or immigration record for your ancestor in America, check the Canadian records. A second reason your ancestor may have been in Canada was for the opportunity to get free land. Your ancestor may have come to Canada to acquire free or low-cost crown land. One way our ancestors could have obtained land was as compensation for militia service. Another way our ancestors acquired land was through the Dominions Lands Act. Now, if your ancestor served on the British side in the American Revolutionary War, or if he fought on the Canadian side, which was really the British side in the War of 1812, then he could have petitioned for free land in Lower Canada, Upper Canada, Nova Scotia, or New Brunswick. And if your ancestor died before he received his land, his widow or children could have also petitioned for it. Now, such was the case of Zalman Mitchell. His father, George Mitchell, had fought on the side of the British in Vermont during the early months of the American Revolutionary War, and he died in 1777. After his father's death, Zalman was the only loyalist in the family. George's widow, Lois, remarried to a man who was a patriot, and all of Zalman's brothers were patriots. So Zalman was the only loyalist in the family, and he settled in Upper Canada after the Revolution. And in 1796, he petitioned for land as the son of a United Empire loyalist. And the petition reads, "To His Excellency the Governor and Council, the petition of Zalman Mitchell of the Township of Augusta in the Eastern District most humbly showeth that your petitioner's father joined His Majesty's services at the commencement of the late American War, and unfortunately lost his life during the unhappy contest, and from his zeal and attachment to the British government, shows that had the distribution of crown lands was good enough to assign him for the benefit of his surviving heirs, lots number 32 and the east half of lot number 34. And then it goes on from there. Now, in 1792, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, Sir John Graves Simcoe, issued a proclamation of a land granting system in Upper Canada. And this was mainly directed toward Americans. As long as you swore an oath of loyalty to the king and gave assurances you would clear and cultivate at least 2 acres of land within a certain period, and usually it was like 3 or 4 years, you could petition for 200 acres of land. So here we have the petition for Thomas Howe of New York, and he was petitioning for land in 1793. Now, Howe was willing to become a subject of His Majesty the King by swearing the oath of allegiance and to become a settler in the province of Upper Canada. Now, after the War of 1812, many former Americans who had taken advantage of this land granting system decided to leave Canada and return to the United States. And what often happens is when Americans are researching their American ancestors and they get to this time frame, the early 1800s, the late 1790s, they can't find them in the United States because their ancestors were actually in Canada at that time and then moved back to the United States after the War of 1812. And that knowledge got lost, down the generations. So if you get stuck researching your American ancestors in that time frame, look to Canada. In particular, look to Upper Canada, which is Ontario. Look to see if perhaps your family was here for 20, 25 years, a generation or so. Another way to receive land was through the Dominion Lands Act, and this applied only to the prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and before 1905, the Northwest Territory. The closure of the U.S. Homestead Act in 1890 made Canada an appealing destination. One could get a free land grant of 160 acres for $10, a $10 administration fee. So roughly about $270 today. And you could also get the adjoining lot. Okay, that could also be purchased again for that $10 administration fee. So by the early 20th century, for about $540 today, you could own 320 acres of land in beautiful Canada. However, those free land grants came with certain restrictions. And one of those was that your lot could not be within 20 miles of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Nonetheless, as we see here from this advertisement, land close to the railways was available at a price. Now, some folks with money could afford to purchase their land from the railway company. The Canadian government was particularly wanted to attract immigrants from the British Empire and Eastern Europe to settle the prairies. And there was a sense of urgency to settle the Canadian West, partly due to the perceived threat of invasion from the Americans. And Canada was eager to avoid another War of 1812. For most of our immigrant ancestors to the prairies, their land was in the middle of nowhere. No one warned them about the brutally cold winters or how difficult it would be to farm on the prairies. Many farms failed, and many people either moved to the cities or migrated to the United States. One such individual who wanted to take advantage of free land in Canada was Ira Burns. In the 1900 U.S. federal census, Ira, age 21, lived in Tintaw Township, Traverse County, Minnesota, where he worked as a livery hand. In the 1906 census of the Northwest provinces, which included Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, Ira, age 27, was recorded as living in Lethbridge, Alberta, having immigrated in 1905 along with his wife, Benedicta. So Library and Archives Canada hosts the searchable database Land Grants of Western Canada, 1870 to 1930. So a search for Ira results in the exact location of Ira's land in Alberta, Northeast Section 35, Township 13, Range 22, west of the Meridian 4, and Folio 48. So that matches the information from the 1906 census of the Prairie Provinces. So with this information, further research of the Alberta land records can be done to see what happened to Ira's land. Unfortunately for us, Ancestry has the Alberta Canada Homestead Records database on their website. So I did a search for Ira. All right, and now we get this result for him. It matches the land description that was found on the Library and Archives Canada website. We get his full name now, Ira Augustus Burns. We have his application date is January 20th, 1905, and he lived in Beauville. Okay, I know it says Boneville on there, but it's actually Beauville. Beauville does not exist any longer, but Boneville is an indexing error. And I have to tell you, many of the Canadian data sets have numerous indexing errors. Okay, so it's always worthwhile to take what's on the transcript and the index as a clue, but you always want to be looking at the original. And fortunately for us, they have been digitized and they're available. So let's dive in. All right, and here is the 1909 Homestead Patent application for Ira. And it shows that he successfully completed the necessary improvements to his land over a period of 4 years. And having successfully completed the provisions required on his land, Ira received a certificate of recommendation for his homestead patent on January 12, 1909. Now, I was not able to find Ira and his family in the 1910 US federal census, the 1911 Canada census, or the 1916 census of the Prairie Provinces. So what happened to Ira? Did he and his family stay in Canada? On April 26, 1917, at the Haver, Montana Land Office, Ira received his patent for 320 acres of land on the east half of Section 11 in the Township 32 of Range 7 east of the Montana Meridian. On September 6, 1917, Ira crossed the border from Montana, arriving at Pinhorn, Alberta. On September 12, 1918, Ira registered for the World War I draft in Flathead County, Montana. In 1920, Ira was enumerated living in Kalispell, Ward 3, Flathead, Montana, with his wife Benedicta and their children, Ethel and Robert. And Ira was working as a luggage man for the railroad. Ira lived the rest of his days in the United States, and he died on March 17, 1947 in Seattle, Washington. Okay, and so this is actually common for men who decided to try their hand at farming on the prairies and found it much too difficult for many reasons, and you see them migrating. All right, and when we look at Ira through this time frame, we see that he's migrating from Alberta to Montana, and then eventually settling in Seattle, Washington. So speaking of migration, were your ancestors just passing through Canada, or had they been here for a while? Generally, the migration pattern through Canada was east to west. The Maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, west through Quebec and Ontario, onto the Western Prairie provinces, or to the United States of America. Perhaps your ancestors were in Canada longer than disembarking from a ship and getting directly on a train or inbound steamer to America. Following your ancestors through census records, birth registrations, and possibly marriage and death registrations can leave a trail of their migration through Canada to the United States. John Egan and his wife, Mary Mulroney, emigrated from Ireland to Canada by 1840. They settled in what is today New Brunswick, but back then it was part of the colony of Nova Scotia. Their daughter, Kathryn Egan, was born there in 1840. Kathryn Egan married James Barron in New Brunswick about 1861-1862. Between 1862 and 1873, James and Kathryn had 10 children. According to the available baptism and census records, the children were all born in New Brunswick. So searching the 1881 and 1891 Canada census resulted in no matches for the Barron family in Canada. Now, based on prior information about the Barron family, I knew they had immigrated to America by the early 1900s. Now, they likely migrated through Ontario to reach there. So I decided to check the Ontario Vital Registration records, and what I found led to a migration trail for this family. So James and Kathryn's daughter Anne died in 1874 in Chatham, Ontario. And additionally, in 1892, their son Samuel was married there. Tracing James and Kathryn's other children led to this time frame for their son Joseph. In 1888, 1889, Joseph was living in Detroit, Michigan. In 1896, he married just across the Detroit River in Windsor, Ontario. By 1900, Joe was back in Detroit, And in 1953, he died in Canton Township, Michigan. Searching for records both in Ontario and Michigan leads to this time frame for James and Kathryn's daughter, Elizabeth. In 1892, she was first married in Woodsley, Ontario, in Canada. Elizabeth was second married in 1921 in Detroit, Michigan. And in 1949, Elizabeth died, and she is buried in Windsor. By researching James and Kathryn's children, a time frame can be established for when the Barron family left New Brunswick to come to Ontario. So it was sometime after the 1872 birth of their youngest child, Minnie, in New Brunswick, and before Anne's 1874 death in Ontario. Kathryn, the matriarch of the family, immigrated to America in 1876. And she was enumerated on the 1900 US federal census as a widow, working as a servant in Detroit, Michigan. And today, descendants of James and Kathryn live in Canada, Michigan, and Utah. 3 important reasons families migrated were unemployment, economic recession, and land. From 1830 through 1890, 60%, yes, 60% of the population of Quebec migrated out of the province. Now, most of the time it was because of unemployment and economic recession. And this just was not in Quebec. It happened in the eastern provinces and Ontario. So this is where you should do some research on the area where your ancestors lived in Canada. What was going on at that time? You might discover the reason they left. Okay, moving on. Did your ancestors say I do in Canada? In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was considered fashionable to marry across the border in Canada. Now, if you can't find your ancestors' marriage record in the United States, then check the provincial vital registration records in Canada. Other reasons for marrying in Canada included shorter waiting times than in the relevant state, or your ancestor may have been hiding something, such as being underage or pregnant. Check to see if perhaps your ancestors were married in Windsor, Ontario. Until the First World War, Windsor was Canada's Gretna Green. At that time, there was no 3-day waiting period to obtain a marriage license. And many couples, many American couples, would cross the border to get married, much to the chagrin of their parents. Okay, so here we have the marriage license of Joseph and Leo. Joseph Greenleaf and Leo Gorham, both of Huron, Ohio, were married in Windsor, Ontario in 1912. Now, I had to do some research here for this couple because I needed to know if there was an error on the bride's name. So a search of the 1920 US federal census showed that Leo really was her name. She was Joseph's wife, and they had 2 children by then in the household, okay? And then in 1920, they were living in Detroit. Okay, so this is may have been the only time they were in Windsor. We don't know, but we have a record for them here in Windsor. Okay, and so they're married. So we don't know the reason why. Maybe it was just, the fashionable thing to do. Maybe they were hiding something. We don't know. But here is their marriage record in Canada, not in the United States. Another example of perhaps a fashionable wedding in Canada was that of Lyman Bronack of Pontiac, Michigan, and his bride, Frances Price. And they were married in 1899. However, they did not marry just across the Detroit River in Windsor, but instead at Niagara Falls, Ontario. And Niagara Falls was a very popular destination because it was the honeymoon capital of the world. All right, I'm sure you folks recognize this person here. Okay. She was born Phoebe Ann Mosey, but most of us know her as Annie Oakley. And she was married to Frank E. Butler. Now, some sources say that Annie and Frank were married on August 23rd, 1876 in Ohio, which would make Annie about 15 years old if she were actually married on that date. Okay. Is that possible? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely? Maybe, maybe not. All right. Well, taking a look at the Ontario marriage registrations, we find this record here for Francis E. Butler and Annie Moses. And it shows that they were married in Windsor, Ontario on June 20th, 1882. So, no marriage record found for them in Ohio, although some sources say that's where they were married. No, they were actually married here in Canada. Okay, let's keep going. Perhaps your ancestor was born in Canada and you haven't found that out yet. Okay, searching the 1940 US federal census, we find the Sadowski household. We have Leo, his wife Christine, and their son Corwin, and they were recorded as all being born in Michigan. A Michigan birth registration for Christine cannot be found. A search of the Michigan marriage registrations for Leo and Christine named her as Christine Nichols, born in Canada. Well, it turns out Christine was born in Windsor, Ontario in 1912 to Scottish parents. And the reason I had so much trouble finding her in the birth registrations was because of this. There is her given name, Agnes Margaret Christine Nicholson. And she had a younger brother, Dougal Alistair Nicholson, and he was also born in Ontario and had immigrated to the United States and settling in Michigan. And over time, he changed his name to Doug Nichols. So what likely happened is that the Nicholson descendants had lost the knowledge that Christine and Doug's names had originally been Nicholson and that they had been born in Canada. And so that happens with names, even, a name like Nicholson, shortening it to fit into their new community in America. Okay, another reason your ancestor was in Canada may have been because he or she died here. Looking at the Ontario death registration for someone like James Hughes, you can see how he might be one of those ancestors you lose track of. James died in 1932 in Windsor, Ontario. And let's take a closer look at his death registration. Okay, so James was born in 1858 in Kentucky. Information on the Ontario death registration stated he was in Windsor at 1125 Moy Avenue for 4 years. So that means he came to Canada about 1928. That also means that after researching him in the 1920 US federal census, you would lose track of him because you aren't going to find him in the 1930 US census. Okay, and you're not finding him in the Kentucky death registrations. So unless you knew that he had moved to Canada, you might think you hit a brick wall with James. The Ontario death registration doesn't provide any clues as to why James and his wife came to Canada, and yet he was here for 4 years, died here, and was buried just outside of Windsor at Green Lawn Memorial Cemetery. Searching the local newspaper, we find this obituary for James. James David Hughes, 74 years old, died Sunday at his home, 1123 Moy Avenue. Mr. Hughes was a native of Kentucky, but had been in the border cities 4 years. Mr. Hughes had been ill for 3 weeks. He was the night watchman at Hartwell Brothers in Walkerville from October 1927, when he came to the border cities until his last illness. A native of Glasgow, Kentucky, he also lived a number of years in Chicago Heights before coming to the border cities. Okay, and so it's always worthwhile looking at the newspapers because they can sometimes fill in those blanks, those answers to the questions we have from the death registration. Sometimes tragedies explain why an ancestor died some other place than where we expect. Franklin Roth Rose Jr. died February 18th, 1965 at the Grand Duck Mines in Stewart, British Columbia. And Frank had been working at the mines for 6 months, and he had been in Canada for only 5 years. His permanent address was Tagish, Yukon. Frank was an American citizen and he was married. He was born in Oakland, California, and both of Frank's parents were American. From the information on the death registration, you see that tragedy struck Franklin and the other miners that fateful day in 1965. An avalanche buried the camp at the mine, and Frank died of suffocation. People leave their home countries for different reasons. Usually, there is the hope and dream of a better life in their new country. Our ancestors wanting to escape poverty, religious or economic persecution, or slavery might have traveled to a number of different places before settling permanently. This is the 1819 land petition of George A. Dartman, yeoman, a man of color. His petition states that George was a native of Virginia, about 50 years old, and had been residing in this province for the last 2 years. I beg to assure your excellency that he has been most desirous of being admitted and a faithful subject of his Britannic Majesty. Okay, so this is Upper Canada. And so it's possible that George escaped slavery during the War of 1812 and made his way to Upper Canada. Now, I came across this census record for John Bowley quite by accident. And until I started researching him, I really had no idea who he was. And it's one of those things, you know, late night researching, you go down that rabbit hole. And that's what happened. I ended up finding John and his family in Chatham, Kent County, Ontario, in the 1861 census of Canada West, because that was what Ontario was called back then. John, his wife, and first 2 children were all born in the United States. All the family members were recorded in the column colored persons, mulatto, or Indian. Just looking from those few facts, right, from the census record, you can guess that John, his wife, and 2 older children had probably been enslaved in the United States. Through further research, I discovered John Bowley's story had been documented. John had been manumitted and was a free person of color in Maryland. However, his wife, Kezia, and their 2 children, Alfred and Araminta, were still enslaved. In 1850, Kezia and the children were going to be sold at a slave auction. However, Kezia was the niece of none other than the abolitionist Harriet Tubman. A daring rescue took place and the Bowley family escaped to Philadelphia. Nonetheless, the Bowleys were not safe there. After a year, they moved to Canada and we found them in Chatham in 1861. Did the Bowley family remain in Chatham in Canada after the Civil War? Well, a search of the 1871 Canada census turned up no results. So where do I want to look next? Right, the 1870 US Census. So the 1870 US Census and the 1870 US Census and 1871 Canada Census, okay, are really 2 important resources, especially when researching African American families, because oftentimes they can only get back as far as 1870 in their research. We know that the 1850 and 1860 censuses for the US African Americans were recorded on the slave schedule, but they were not recorded by name, okay? Only by sex, color, and age only. Okay, so the 1870 is the first census where they are recorded by also their name. All right, the 1871 Canada census was the first federal census taken after the Confederation of Canada. So if you cannot find an ancestor on one census, then you need to check the other. All right, so African Americans were seeking a better life after African Americans who were seeking a better life after slavery came to Canada, and those who had fled slavery for the freedom of Canada often returned home to the United States, seeking to reunite with family and friends. Okay, so here is the 1870 U.S. federal census for John Boley, and there's his wife Kezia. And now we have different children in the household. We have Harkness, Josiah, and Pleasant. Okay, and the family is now residing in Church Creek, Dorchester County, Maryland. All right, notice that John and Kezia's birthplaces were also Maryland, and then we have next to their names their ages, okay, sex, and male or female, and the letter B. Okay, so here we have the right family, right? African American family, and then we see here that the children were all born in Canada. So from that time frame, from that 1861 census to 1870, 3 more children born to the family, but they were born in Canada. All right, so when you get stuck in that time frame during that Civil War time period, you need to look at the 1870 census or the 1871 census. All right, during the Civil War, Isa Desha Breckinridge was a Confederate sympathizer from Alexandria, Virginia, when the Union Army invaded. And she wrote this on July 30th, 1864, from the Queen's Hotel, Toronto, Canada West. I am here on exile. On the night of the 8th, Papa learned that the wives of all rebel officers in Kentucky were to be sent south in the most disagreeable way and to land God knows where. He begged me to start the next day for Canada, knowing that to go south at this season would be certain death to me, and trembling at the thought of my being in the hands of our fiendish foe. Many Confederate sympathizers, fearing persecution, fled north to Canada, seeking safety. Does it surprise you to learn that former Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his wife Verena joined their 2 older children in Montreal upon his release from prison in 1867? The 2 older children had been sent to Montreal along with Davis's mother-in-law before his capture during the Civil War. And while in Canada, Davis traveled to Toronto and Niagara, Ontario. And it was there that Davis offered some remarks about Canada that were later reported in the New York Times. Quote, I thank you sincerely for the honor you have this evening shown to me. It shows that true British manhood to which misfortune is always attractive. May peace and prosperity be forever the blessing of Canada, for she has been the asylum for many of my friends, as she is now an asylum to myself. I hope that Canada may forever remain a part of the British Empire, and may God bless you all, and the British flag never cease to wave over you. During the 19th and 20th centuries, Jews, Mennonites, and Doukhobors from Europe, Mormons from the Western United States, okay, all fleeing religious persecution from their governments, came to Canada seeking refuge and a new life. So if you have ancestors being part of these religious and cultural groups, you can't find them coming into the United States, check the Canadian records. All right, lastly, did your American ancestors serve in the Canadian forces? Your American ancestor may have served in the militia supporting Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War or the War of 1812. And if your ancestor fought in the First World War or the Second World War, he may have fought in the Canadian forces instead of or before serving in the US forces. Okay, so here is a militia rule for the 1st Regiment of the Durham Militia in Upper Canada. Upon closer examination, we see here that William Munson and Zachariah Odell have had a change of heart about which side they were supporting in the War of 1812. So after serving their time, they both went off during the war to the enemy. All right, and that means you guys, the Americans. And this was actually more common than you might imagine. Many people changed sides during the American Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. And sometimes they changed sides depending on which militia was in town at the time. As part of the British Empire, the Dominion of Canada entered the First World War along with Australia and Great Britain on August 4th, 1914. The United States didn't enter the war until April 6, 1917, so almost 3 years after the Great War began. By early 1917, there was a shortage of men needed for the war, and conscription was passed in Canada, and this was greatly opposed in Quebec. However, many young American men were anxious to answer the call. So look for your ancestors' participation in the First World War in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. You want to start with the personnel records of the First World War, and you want to start at Library and Archives Canada. And when you go on to Library and Archives Canada website, you want to get down to this link here, and the information's in your handout, okay? But we're looking for the personnel records of the First World War, all right? And then what that does is it takes you to the database. Now, it will probably take you to what's called the collection search database, which is what the updated Library and Archives Canada website does. They've been continuously updating it since 2022, and now they have the great big search database called the collection search. But using that link helps you narrow it down. Okay, and there, if you use the advanced search, you can narrow down which database it's searching. All right, so you can search by the name of the soldier. Okay, the Canadian Expeditionary Force service files have been indexed and digitized. Okay, so that all of those who joined the CEF had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king, and this included Americans. Okay, so here's an example of some Americans who served in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, they probably all lived along the border states, along Canada. But guess what? We're going to take a dive in and take a closer look, and you might be surprised to see where they were from. Okay, so Clemens McNeil was from Shreveport, Louisiana, and he enlisted at Youngstown, Alberta. Leah McDaniel from Haines, Arkansas, enlisted at Halifax, Nova Scotia. Forrest Jasper Foster was from Belmont, Arkansas, and he enlisted at London, Ontario. And Joseph McCallum from Rochelle, Georgia, enlisted at St. Louis, Prince Edward Island. Harry James Smith was from San Francisco, California, and he enlisted at Regina, Saskatchewan. Okay, so here we have the attestation paper for Forrest Jasper Foster of Belmont, Arkansas. Okay, and he joined the CEF on January 3rd, 1916. Okay, his service file is on Library and Archives Canada website. And initially, Private Foster was declared missing between September 20th and October 4th, 1916, while serving with the 18th Battalion. And then it was later determined he had been killed in action on October 1st, 1916. If a serviceman or servicewoman died in service to a Commonwealth nation such as Canada, they will likely be listed on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website. So a search for Forrest Jasper Foster. Okay, and we get this information for him. Okay, it matches the information that's in his service file. Okay, and so he's buried or commemorated at the Vimy Memorial in Pas de Calais, France. So he was killed during the Battle of the Somme. Additional information states he was the son of Frank and Mary C. Foster of Central City, Nebraska. During the Second World War, Canada followed on the heels of Britain and declared war on the Nazi Third Reich on September 10th, 1939. The United States did not enter the war until December 8th, 1941. So again, almost 2 years difference there. All right, so just like the First World War, young Americans, okay, men want to see action and do their part against the fight against Hitler. And so they were frustrated that the United States was taking so long to participate. Now, this time, a bit of a difference between the First World War and the Second World War. So an agreement was made between Canada and the US permitting Americans to serve in the Canadian forces during World War II without having to take an oath or of allegiance to the king. So that then allowed them to leave the Canadian forces and join the American forces once US declared war on Germany. So look to see if your ancestors served in both the Canadian and American forces during World War II. Okay, if you had an ancestor who served and died, okay, this is important. If they survived, they're not going to be in these service files, but if they died while in service to Canada, you may be able to find your ancestors' service file, either on Library and Archives Canada website or on ancestry.ca. And these service files contain oodles of personal details about the men who served in the Royal Canadian Navy, Royal Canadian Air Force, and the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. Okay, so here we have Sergeant Harold Barber Moore, and he was from Boone Mills, Virginia. He joined the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force, as a pilot officer and was the rear gunner on his crew. On the night of March 1st, 2nd, 1943, Sergeant Moore, along with his crew of 7 other men, were dispatched for a bombing raid over Berlin, and their aircraft was shot down. Initially, Sergeant Moore was reported missing. However, upon further investigation, it was confirmed that he had been killed in action over enemy territory. Sergeant Harold Moore's service files contained numerous letters from his mother, as well as a photo of Harold himself. A search for Harold on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, okay, confirms he was a pilot officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force 76th Squadron. He died March 2nd, 1943, age 23 years old. Because Sergeant Moore was serving with the Commonwealth country, okay, he's buried overseas. And so that's something that's really important for you to remember. If you have an American who served in the Canadian forces, okay, and died while in service to the Canadian forces, he's likely buried overseas. Okay, so Canada did not bring home their servicemen and women. Okay, they were buried close to where they fell in Europe. Okay, so Sergeant Moore, his remains were not returned to the United States, and he's buried at the Schuschelhof Cemetery in Antwerp, Belgium. Okay, so as we wrap things up, I want to remind you that the next time you get stuck in your research, ask yourself, was my American ancestor ever in Canada? And you just might find them there. And then with that, I am going to turn things back over for some questions.
Does anybody have any questions? If anybody has questions, she'd ask that you would come up to the computer
so that she can hear better. Well, I have one. So I actually had a great grandfather. He was born in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
And so his family, as best I could tell, they were there from at least late 1700s. So I'm not sure if there's any association with the American Revolution or not. But it seems like, there was about 10 or 12 kids in his family. His father ended up dying there in Nova Scotia. But it seems like it was like throwing a rock in a bush with a flock of quails. So like all the kids scattered.
Okay.
Was there anything going on in the he was born in 1867, left in the 1880s. Anything going on in that neck of Canada that time that would have propelled basically a whole family of kids to have left? His mother actually ended up, and thanks to Find a Grave, I found that she's actually buried up in one of the cemeteries in San Francisco, California. So I was just wondering, was there some impetus, something going on at that time, or just happened to be that they had things of going elsewhere?
Okay, so a couple of things. Look, if you can find them in Nova Scotia, look to see what the occupations were. If they were farmers, farming in Nova Scotia was really, really hard. The soil is not actually too beneficial for farming there. And so a lot of people left. And sometimes you might see if they were fishermen too. It's probably economic reasons why they left, depending on where they were in Nova Scotia and depending what they were doing. Oftentimes, just because life was hard there, it's a beautiful place to visit. But in the 1860s, it was not the easiest place to live. And so people would often just leave for better opportunity. The American West was opening up. You're going to get land, so more land was available and better quality farming land, certainly better farming land in California than in Nova Scotia.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
I have an uncle that was in Vancouver, British Columbia. Isn't that part of Canada?
Yeah. Yes, it is.
Do your records go all the way to the West Coast?
Yeah. So depending on what you're researching, you're going to be either looking at Library and Archives Canada for federal records, or you're going to be looking at the BC Archives for provincial records.
Okay.
And the BC Archives has a really nice website. They have quite a few databases available for birth, marriages, and deaths. So that can help you. And I've not been on the BC Archives website in a while, but I found their website actually was pretty decent when it comes to researching online compared to some of the other provincial archives. So those are two places there that you could get started.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other question? Thank you very much, Kathryn. It's very detailed. Very informative. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me tonight, everybody. And I hope to see you again in the future. All right. I'll say good night. Thank you.
Bye.